some of the PowerShell and Azure automation. So we are going to look at a whole bunch of things here around automating Microsoft 365, connecting PowerShell, connecting Power Automate, all kinds of fun things here and how it applies to Microsoft 365, but we can do it with a whole bunch of other stuff as well. So a little bit about me, too. I am the owner. I have my own company, Intelligent, that I have had for about 9 years now. I have been doing Office 365 training. I've been doing SharePoint for over 15 years. I've been doing SharePoint since SharePoint 2003 was where I got my start with that. Office 365 since before it was Office 365, back when it was still BPAWS. Also a few websites up there. Ben Stedgink is my blog. Intelligent is my company. I also have a weekly newsletter, the Microsoft Cloud Report, that touches on some Azure, gears a little bit towards Microsoft 365. If you want any of those, Ben Stedgink on Twitter, if you want to go look me up there, or frankly, just Google Ben Stedgink. I'm the only Ben Stedgink out there, so I own the whole first page of any search engine. So really easy to find me just using my name. I also have a podcast, the Microsoft Cloud IT Pro podcast, that I host with another guy, Scott Hogue. Go check that out. We release that weekly as well. And then there's my family. If you start hearing people in the background, they woke up early. I have 4 kids, 8, 6, 4, and 2. So they keep us pretty busy. Diving into the topic a little bit. And as we go, feel free to ask questions too. I know you see my video. My camera's here. The chat's here. And where I'm presenting is all the way over here. So if you see me looking, or if you start looking at the back of my head, I'm just looking at the screen I'm sharing. But yes, feel free to post questions in the chat as we go. I love interacting, answering questions, trying to solve problems as we go through this, and hopefully as some light bulbs start clicking around different things you can do. So the overview of this session, we're going to take a look at Azure Automation. We're going to take a look at Power Automate, formerly known as Flow. And then we are going to look at how we can kind of start connecting those to Microsoft 365, some real world examples with Power Automate and how we do this. And yes, I very much have some Dutch roots. I grew up in Kalamazoo, Michigan, right outside, about 45 minutes away from Holland. And we always joke around in that part of Michigan. We play Dutch bingo because everybody knows everybody else and is related to everybody. So I know lots of Vans and yes, lots of other Dutch people. So that assumption was correct, that I am very much rooted in the Dutch. I even have cousins that used to clog dance in the Tulip Time Parade. Anyways, little side topic there as I was watching chat. So getting started, Power Automate. This is the first part we're going to look at, and at the end, you'll kind of see how these all get pulled together. What is Power Automate? If you aren't familiar with it, Power Automate is the automation engine, business process engine within the Microsoft 365 suite. If you have Office 365, you have some basic licensing for it. So you're able to go in and start creating automations. If this happens, go take a series of steps within Microsoft 365, within various Azure services, as we'll see. There's several different things you can do with Power Automate where you can have different conditions, different branches, different rules. So lots of different options around automating some of these business processes. And some of the questions from the last sessions, like people talked about, was licensing, or maybe it's updating properties of users in Office 365. Maybe it's certain steps that you want to take with onboarding or with creating various resources within Microsoft 365. So lots of different options there that are available to kind of create those business processes. And the way you get started with it, there's a lot of templates out there about how you can automate different things within Microsoft 365, how you can connect different services, because to be fair, it's not just Microsoft 365 either. It is also other services, Twitter, Facebook, Excel workbooks, all of those. And it looks like Teams keeps yelling at me that my video has stopped. So if my video is laggy, or if my audio gets laggy in my screen and it gets hard to keep track, let me know, and I may just have to kill my video to save bandwidth. I am not 100% sure what's going on. But you can also start with blank templates within Power Automate. You can start with a blank canvas and just start building it out, where start with a trigger and start building out what you want to do. The other nice thing about Power Automate is you can use service accounts to connect to different services. So if you want to take actions in SharePoint or in Azure AD or other services with Microsoft 365, you can use a service account to make the connection to those services, so you don't actually have to grant the end user permission to access those various services within Power Automate. And things to watch out for. We're going to look at logic apps here in a minute. I'm going to do a little bit of a compare and contrast of the two. But one thing with Power Automate is it does tend to be a little bit more, I would say, power user focused. Power users can create them. They can create automations in them. They can do all kinds of various tasks within there. And you as an administrator don't always know. It is owned by the user that creates it. Unless they share it with you, you may not know it exists. On the flip side, if they ever leave the company, there could be a critical business process that is based on that user's flow that they created, a flow that's owned by them, that other people may not be aware of. It may stop working because it was tied to their user account. It may be working and nobody knows how it's working because it's tied to their user account. So the other thing to take a look at when you go into it is logic apps. Do I actually want to use a logic app versus flow? A lot of times I compare these. They're organizational versus personal. The logic apps are owned by the organization. They exist within your Azure subscription. So going back to that last point, they're a little bit easier to see, to manage from an administrative perspective. There's a lot of benefits to doing logic apps. They are hosted in Azure versus Office 365. One of the downsides is Office 365 and the Power Automate is free with your plan. You don't have to pay for it. You get a quota of so many runs that you can use. When you start getting into logic apps in Azure, you do have to pay for the actions you're using. You have to pay for the number of runs. It's relatively small. I mean, you're talking a few cents, a few dollars. So it's not a ton, and a lot of companies will find that the trade-off is worth it. When it comes to using logic apps versus flow, Power Automate, you can always start in Power Automate 2. You can now export flows from Power Automate into logic apps if you want to go that route. So you can transition back and forth between the two of them. Everything I am going to show today can be used in both logic apps or in a flow in Power Automate, with one condition, that Power Automate, when I first started talking about this and showing some of this, that connection between Power Automate and Azure Automation that we're going to look at next was free. Since I've started doing this, that has now become a premium connector within Power Automate. So you do have to pay for that additional Power Automate licensing to have access to premium connectors to be able to link up Power Automate and Azure Automation, which is where a lot of the power that we're going to look at comes into play. With logic apps, it's still free. So what you will actually start to find is that it may be cheaper to pay for the logic app and the number of runs and actions you're going to have in the logic app versus using your free Power Automate license, but then having to upgrade it to a per flow or upgrade it essentially to one of those premium plans to get those premium connectors to Azure Automation. So again, something to be aware of as you start kind of thinking through this is that additional licensing cost has been introduced by making Azure Automation a premium connector. So getting started with Azure Automation, and then we're going to jump into a demo. This, you kind of got an introduction to this in the last session, if you were around for the previous one, where Azure Automation was introduced. You started getting that introduction to the PowerShell gallery, to being able to run PowerShell in Azure Automation. The way I think about Azure Automation, at least for the purpose of this discussion, because there's a lot of things you can do with Azure Automation, is it's a way to run PowerShell in the cloud. A lot of Microsoft 365 administrators, Office 365 administrators have written a lot of PowerShell. They've really learned to leverage PowerShell over the years to perform some of their administrative tasks. And when you start going to the cloud, now you start running into, where do I run that PowerShell? Do I spin up VMs in Azure? I don't really want to pay for a VM in Azure. Or do I run them on my local computer, but now I have a local computer connected to the cloud if I want to schedule them? I grew up with a SharePoint background. We used to create scheduled tasks all the time on servers to run some of our PowerShell scripts. And once you go to the cloud, you lose that. You don't have the servers anymore that are running your Office 365 services. You don't run the PowerShell straight on the servers. Where do you use it? And that's where, for me, Azure Automation comes into play. Is now I can start using this as a low-cost solution for running my PowerShell in Office 365, which is, what does it cost? The nice thing is it's actually free for the first 500 minutes of PowerShell that you're running. So it's not the first 500 minutes of the month, but it is the first 500 minutes that the script is actually running. So if you have a 1-minute script, you can run it 500 times over the course of a month for free. What I have found, most people, 500 minutes of free PowerShell is enough in a given month. If you do go over that, it is 0.25 cents per minute after that first 500 free minutes. So even if you do start trickling over the 500 minutes, the cost for Power Automate is actually relatively cheap. And then features, you have scheduling. I know there were some questions in the last session about scheduling some things. You have scheduling built right into Azure Automation. So you can schedule those scripts to run on a regular basis, whether it's daily or weekly or monthly, even down to, I believe, hourly is the most frequent you can get PowerShell scripts to run in Azure Automation. You can store variables out there. You can store credentials out there. So there's lots of functionality built right into Azure Automation that does allow you to run those scripts on a regular basis, to build out all of those scripts that you used to use in an on-premises environment and do them right in the cloud natively. A couple words of caution. You can run into some things if you have a really long-running script. Think a script that starts running for longer than an hour, 90 minutes, 2 hours. Microsoft does put some what they call fair use constraints within Azure Automation so that a user doesn't write a script that just runs nonstop, runs 24/7, 365 days a year, and starts consuming all of the resources. Or if you write a script inadvertently that maybe has an infinite loop in it and you don't realize it. This fair use essentially says you can use some resources, but you're not going to take all the resources. And you can run this for a little while, but you're not going to run it for 3, 4, 5 hours at a time. They will actually stop your script, boot you out so other people can use the resources if your script is running for too long. So if you do run into that, you can also run PowerShell workflows in Azure Automation, if you're familiar with them. It allows you to set checkpoints, to save stages as you go through it. they're not as straightforward to write as a straightforward PowerShell script. But if you do have something that needs to run for a long time, you can write it as a PowerShell workflow so that when you get kicked out due to that fair use policy that's in place for Azure Automation, you can kind of pick up right where you left off, or at least pick up where that last checkpoint is when it comes to your Power Automate. So enough talking. Let's go in and actually create this Azure Automation service and start looking at some of those things that we talked about. So I know my video was laggy. Let me know if my screen share also gets laggy. Hopefully it's something with my camera and it's not my bandwidth. So here we have one of my Azure subscriptions, and I have automation accounts right up here at the top. If you're looking for it, if you're not using it a lot and you want to start creating your own, all you have to do is just look for automation. That'll come right up. I have a few of these created already, so you can see some of my Office 365 ones, some demo accounts. All you have to do to create one is click Add, fill in the name. So we will just call this an automation demo. Pick a subscription that you want to put it in, a resource group, keep going to my demos, location, run as account, create. That'll go out, go create an account. That deployment will be in progress. This usually creates relatively quickly. It already created the account. It's creating that run as account. And in a minute here, we should get it. So we can go to our resource. Here's a brand new Azure Automation account. It was that quick to stand up, get going. Some of the things we talked about as you scroll down, and mention the last one is runbooks. So logic also have do well, in case kind of logic. So yeah, the logic apps or Azure Automation does have some looping that you can put in place there. You could also do looping right in your PowerShell script, so it would kind of depend on where you'd want that looping to take place, whether it's in that business process or that workflow that you build out in Logic Apps or Power Automate, or in the script itself. So runbooks are going to be those scripts that you create. You can have a whole bunch of runbooks in there, different scripts that you want to run. This is where they're going to be. So if we go in, create a runbook, we'll do a brand new demo runbook, pick our type. You can see there you have your PowerShell. You do have your PowerShell workflow down here. We'll grab PowerShell, create a runbook, and this will be a new PowerShell script that we can go start writing it. And it is just normal PowerShell. Write host, and we can do the traditional hello world. You can have a test pane, so you can go out and test your runbook, see how it goes. It's going to go submit it. Again, you're running it in the cloud. It's not going to be instantaneous like you used to on your machine, where it's going to queue it up. It's going to start it. Once it actually runs and finishes, you'll get the output over here, which, believe it or not, I've actually had mixed luck with it actually showing the output. And it's not going to behave for me today. But we can go back to edit. You'll have commandlets if you do want to browse through commandlets that are available. It's over there. Some of those assets that we talked about, I'll show you where you can do those. Once you've created it, you want it, you can just click publish, go ahead and publish it. It's going to be available to use. Going through, giving an overview, jobs, this will give you previous jobs that have run. I'm skipping over a lot of these that you may not use. There's a bunch, like I said, there's a bunch of other stuff in Azure Automation too. So I'm going to highlight what I use for the Microsoft 365 stuff. Scheduling, if you want to start building out those schedules that we talked about. We can go in, add some schedules out there. Maybe this is a daily schedule that we want to use. It's going to start at 5:55 a.m. once. We can make it recurring. And this is where you can go in and start specifying. We want it to run every hour. We're going to set this to daily. If you want an expiration, you can set an expiration on there. All of that's available within scheduling, and you can create this schedule. This schedule is now available to use. This isn't going to run all your PowerShell scripts or have anything specific around all of the scripts. It's available now to start tying to different scripts within the environment. You do have all those PowerShell modules. In a minute, we'll talk a little bit more about Microsoft 365 and where this comes into play with that. Your modules gallery, credentials. These are those stored credentials that you may want to use. We talked about being able to put credentials in here. If I have my SharePoint credentials that I want to use, and I think I have a PowerShell, and I'm making up a password here, so it's not going to work, but you can see it's in there. I think that's what I typed. Nope. There we go. Once your passwords match, you can go ahead and create that credential. So it has a username and password. It's a credential object that you can start using in your scripts, whether this is to connect to Microsoft 365, to Exchange Online, to SharePoint, to Teams, to the Power Platform, to Azure AD. That credential object is out there and available to use. Within your scripts now, you can do certificates. But really, from a high level, those are the big things that are going to come into play that you're going to want to use when you start playing with Microsoft 365. We did talk about variables. Maybe you have your root level URL, root SharePoint URL that you want to save. That would be something like demo.sharepoint.com for Office 365, just so you always have that available to use. You can go in and create those variables. Once you have variables, once you have credentials, you can go back into your runbooks. You can open up our demo one that we used before. Edit this one. Damien, that is the one issue that you start running into is MFA. It depends. I will say it depends on the module. Some of the modules support connecting to Office 365 using a client ID and an app ID. So you can go in and grant permissions using a client ID and an app ID. So it doesn't support MFA, but you can kind of get around it leveraging that. If you're just using credentials that require MFA, it's not going to work primarily because it is automation running in the background. So there's not even anybody really available to necessarily log in with MFA. So none of that's there. You have to hope that the modules you're going to use support some other method, or you can create like a credential that maybe has one of the newer 256 character passwords and doesn't have MFA on it. You can secure that one account a little bit more. Stefan, I'm not going to go into watcher tasks at all. That's honestly something I haven't used within Power Automate. And I'm probably still going to run out of time because that always happens during the session. But going back into this, so we stored those credential options. Now we can go do something like cred, and we can actually go browse our credentials. Here's that SharePoint credential. David, we are going to get to that here very shortly, and how PowerShell ties in with Power Automate. So now we can add the canvas. So I now was able to get my credential, get that credential name. I could do the same thing with my root level URL for SharePoint, or I could do URL, and I had those variables, root SharePoint site. We can do the get variable. You saw you can also do a set variable. So if you would want to update that variable down the road, you can do that. So we could publish those updates to our runbook now. And this is where we also talked about linking to a schedule. So if we did want to run this on that daily basis, we can go out and grab that daily schedule now. If we wanted to modify parameters or had parameters in here, we could set those parameters that we're running as well. So now we can click on OK, click OK. So this job is now set. It's going to run on that daily schedule. If we would want to just trigger it automatically, we can always click Start. It'll go out and run the job, and you will get any of that input that you may have, output, errors, warnings. It'll separate them out, or you can view all the logs, exceptions, anything in there. So hopefully this will run here in a minute, and we can look at some of the output. You'll also see there are some other ways to trigger it. You can trigger these from webhooks. I'm not a developer. I don't do webhooks very often. I like my Power Automate and doing it, taking other methods to launching my PowerShell scripts. And naturally, this is going to take a little bit. We'll come back to this one, see if it's run. If you do want to view it without editing it, you can always click to view your PowerShell as well. One thing I don't tend to do, I don't write a lot of my complex scripts in Power Automate. There is no type ahead tabbing, any of the things you might be used to when you're writing PowerShell. You can tie these into GitHub or into, that was one other thing I forgot to mention. You can tie these into source control, into GitHub, into Azure DevOps. That's what I tend to do with mine, so that I can write all of my PowerShell on my machine. I write it in Visual Studio Code, and then I can publish it to GitHub, let GitHub sync up to my Azure Automation account, so that I can author my scripts and get them easily up there. You can always do a copy and paste option as well. But that source code integration is there, and it does make it easier then to kind of author those PowerShell scripts and get them into Azure Automation. Let's go see if my demo one ran yet. Now it completed. So now we can go look at output. It didn't like my right host, but it also didn't have any errors. But you can see it ran. If it did have errors or output, it would be here. I can show you some of the demo ones in a little bit, where I do have a little bit more of that output there. Parameters, I'll show you one of some parameters here in a little bit as well. And I'm trying to keep an eye on my time. And if I want to jump back to slides, I'm not jumping back to my slides. We're just going to keep going with demos, because those are more fun anyways. So tying this into Microsoft 365, that's kind of an overview. We've written some basic PowerShell. Now you want to start leveraging Microsoft 365. Kind of like I said, the biggest thing you run into is there's no support for MFA. David, yes, you could use HTTP, the webhook, to trigger these as well, if that is your method of choice for launching these runbooks within PowerShell. So this was another one of those that was mentioned in the last session, is some of the modules. Because Azure Automation is geared a little bit more towards Azure, you get a lot of the Azure modules that are already added to your environment. However, this looks at the same, sorry, my nose, my allergies are driving me nuts here in Florida. This looks at the same PowerShell gallery that you would use if you're running normal PowerShell, the PS gallery. So that means anything that you use for Microsoft 365 that's available in the PowerShell gallery is also available for you in Azure Automation. So we can go out and browse the gallery. I got started in SharePoint. So again, I like my SharePoint modules. If I search for SharePoint, you'll notice there's the Microsoft SharePoint Online PowerShell module. We can go grab that one, start importing that one. I like my PNP modules. This is the older PNP module. We can grab that one. The new one, if you haven't looked at it yet, there's also PNP PowerShell now. Not PHP. PNP PowerShell. This is the new one that works on PowerShell core. So if we'd want to import that one, let's say we're doing stuff with Microsoft Teams, we want our Teams modules, we can go import our Teams module. That one works out there. They recently added the Exchange Online. This one just GA'd too. The Exchange Online management shell for working with Exchange Online. So that is out there. So you can just start going out and starting to grab all of these modules for PowerShell and using these now within your scripts. I know people are asking about Power Platform as well. Is it the Power Apps? Yeah, you have your Power Apps administration modules. Damien, this does not update the modules, unfortunately. That is one of my gripes with this, is it won't auto-update them. Although there have also been some modules that have broken stuff. So from a change control perspective, there are times when I've been glad it hasn't updated the modules. What I tend to do is when I'm ready to update the modules, if you go back to the browse gallery, and let's say there was a new version out there of PNP PowerShell, if you go click on it and do an import, if it's already there, it will go out and update the module. I think you could probably write, I've never tried to do it, I should add it to my list. You should be able to actually write a runbook to go run PowerShell, to go auto-update these modules, and you can run it on a set basis. I do just tend to update mine manually when I come in, when I'm making some updates. As long as everything's working and there's no major issues, I will, it's more of a manual update. Azure AD, Azure AD, Azure AD Preview are both out there. Someone asked about licensing. So if you do want to start doing the licensing, there are some third-party scripts out here. Like these are not the Microsoft ones. I don't think the Microsoft, was the Microsoft Online one ever made available in the gallery? I don't think it was. But you can use these Azure AD ones, Azure AD and Azure AD Preview. This is the next iteration of the MSOL module. It's not, I don't think it's 100% feature parity yet, but these can be used to assign licenses to users and to manage users in terms of updating additional properties in Azure AD. So either Azure AD or Azure AD Preview are also both modules that you may want to import and use. So as you start importing those, you'll notice, I don't know that I clicked online for all of them. Let's do a refresh. I have my Azure AD one here. I have my Exchange Online Management. There's the Microsoft Teams. So all those modules are in there, loaded, ready to start using to connect with Microsoft 365. Do a time check a minute. So let's dive into, I'm going to dive into one of my demo accounts now that actually has more of those Microsoft 365 scripts in it. We're going to kind of start trickling into some of the real world examples, and I am going to show you kind of how to bring it all together too at the end here. So I think this demo that I have a bunch of my scripts in. Yep, so here's one of those Azure automation accounts that I do have a bunch of those PowerShell scripts in. This one is also synced with GitHub. So it's pulling all of these scripts from one of my Azure automation accounts. And this is one of those, Provision Office 365 group. One of the scenarios, can we connect back to on-premises resources from our automation account? Daniel, yes, you can use an agent in that run as account to connect back to on-premises servers. I have not tried using this to connect back and write like a PowerShell script against a SharePoint server or an Exchange server, but there are ways that you can go back in and connect to physical servers to run your PowerShell scripts. Let's go take a look at this job. So here is a little bit a PowerShell script with a bit more detail on it, where I did start creating to connecting to Microsoft 365. One of my favorite scripts was let me go create a list out in SharePoint and allow people to request Microsoft Teams, Office 365 groups, SharePoint sites via an approval process that's all kicked off by a SharePoint list. And go leverage Power Automate to create a request to do the approval process. But then once that request has been submitted, actually go through and create the team, create the SharePoint site, set different properties on it, set different configuration options on it. Maybe it's adding content types if you've used those in SharePoint. A bunch of stuff that you can't do without writing PowerShell. So in this one, it's a script that takes a bunch of different parameters, the group display name, the alias for the group, the access type, private versus public, who the owners are, a primary and secondary owner, if this should create a team or if it should just create an Office 365 group, friendly aliases, if this group should be visible in the address book. And it goes out. I set some properties at the beginning here where I set my tenant, I set my domain, and then I start getting credentials. So I do have a PowerShell admin credential because Exchange Online, and this is still using an old remote PowerShell session that didn't support MFA. Azure Automation doesn't support MFA. So I did need this user credential for connecting to Exchange Online. This is where I went out and grabbed that client ID and secret. I put those in variables. My client secret is an encrypted variable, so it's not going to be visible within UI at least. And then the PNP PowerShell scripts support that client secret and app ID. So even though I may be enforcing MFA on my SharePoint environment, I can use the app ID and secret. You'll see, just for reminders to myself, I did put those app permissions that are needed. Teams, I think I'm using, where did I create Teams? Teams, I was still using a user credential for Teams as well. I think I started to look at using a certificate to connect to Microsoft Teams because that module supported using a app ID and certificate for connecting. So again, it kind of depends module to module in terms of how you're going to connect. But from here on out, it's really just PowerShell. If my create team variable was false, then I'm just going to create that Microsoft 365 group or that Office 365 group using my new unified group command. If I need a team, I'm going to go out and connect to Teams and create a new team. Some of this you can actually do in Power Automate now, and you can just go make tweaks to it with Azure Automation. It actually waits for that group to be created because if I want to perform additional actions to that group in terms of document libraries or configuration settings within that Microsoft 365 group, I need the group in place in order to continue. This is setting that Microsoft 365 group to be private or public, going out, doing some things with some of the users and owners and members of the group to add or remove users, set up group owners, and then set some of those properties on the Microsoft 365 group. Set the email for the group to a friendly alias, set up that group display name, go in and set if external users are able to email the group or to not email the group, address book visibility, all of those types of settings. So this is one of mine. I have done, as you can see, a bunch of different ones. If it's copying multi-value SharePoint lookup fields between two lists, something that's not supported in Azure Automation out of the box. Provisioning OneDrive for Business. I've built some reporting solutions where it goes and looks through my environment and gets details about Exchange Online for doing some reporting on Office 365 on Exchange Online. So any of those PowerShell scripts that you may want to write can be supported. You can run them in Azure Automation. May have to do a few tweaks because of stuff like the MFA, but it's out there. So how do you start tying this together now with Azure Automation? One of those we looked at, let's go back to my Provision Office 365 groups. I had all those parameters defined at the beginning. If I go start this within Azure Automation, you'll see that it's going to prompt for all of these parameters, tell me what they are, if they're required or not. Now I want to trigger this from my SharePoint list, like I had talked about before. If you're in Power Automate, or if you're in Logic Apps, kind of like I said, both of these are going to work the same when it comes to starting to launch these and trigger these. I have this SharePoint list out there. If I jump back here, this is my SharePoint list that I have for requesting groups and for requesting teams. If I click New, I've done some customizations here with Power Apps. So users could go in and say they need a new team, display name. Those access types that we talked about, if it's a private team, if this is maybe for a project, and if it's a project, I actually set a project end date so I can keep track of, do I still need this team around? Owners is just a lookup to Azure AD. So I could go grab my account. If I wanted this tied to a specific department, a friendly alias, they save it. This is actually going to go trigger that flow right here, where it's grabbing a new item from SharePoint. It's starting an approval process. So hopefully here in a minute, I'll have an email. And then it goes in and initializes a few variables, a group prefix and a SharePoint URL. Now, if this is approved, it goes through and starts the process of creating that team or that group based on that that input from the users in terms of what they need. I like using numbers for all of my sites, so it gets the number of the site that's tracked in the SharePoint list, that group alias. But where it really comes in is you'll see all the way down here, I have this create job. This is an action, and if you go into your actions and search for automation, you'll actually see right here is an Azure Automation action within Power Automate. Like I said, the same Azure Automation action exists within Logic Apps as well. If I select Azure Automation, and you'll notice it's premium, I can create a job, get the job output, or get the status of a job. So if that job is running, if it's taking a while to go through everything, and I want to set a loop in Power Automate or in Logic Apps to watch that status, or once it's done, if I do want to get the output from the console and see what that is, I can grab that. More often than not, I don't use those two. I just want to create the job. From here, I can go start picking now all of those. I've connected to Azure first, so I am using my account to connect to Azure. I can go grab my subscription, and this was my demo subscription. The resource group that I have it in is demos. Now I have those automation accounts, so you can see this is the one we actually created earlier. If I would select automation demo, I have that demo script that we created, and then wait for the job to complete or not. So this, if I have this yes, it's going to sit there, wait for that whole PowerShell job to run before it moves on to the next step. I almost always select that because usually the next step, like sending that the group email has created, is going to be dependent on that actually running. Now, the really cool thing is, if we were to go back up here and switch back to my IntelliGenk demo and go grab that Microsoft, I don't need help. Go grab that Provision Office 365 group that had a whole bunch of those parameters that we had to pass in. If I select that, it picks up all of those parameters, and I can literally just start filling these out from my input. So I have my display name because the user entered that earlier. I have the owner that the user entered earlier. So this would be the, I think for this one I tended to use the creator claims, but you can set the claims for the owner. You can go in, Damien, I'm glad I made your day. It's always good to make somebody's day. So yes, group access type, I can go in and fill out the group access type. Only I'd want the value, not the actual access type. So if I delete this and go look at this create job one, you can see that I have everything filled out. I got my email up here, I believe, do not disturb, because it's the weekend. Here's that new request. Yep, we're going to go ahead and approve this. So that will go in and submit it. And if we would go back and look at our flows here, here's the one I started 3 minutes ago that's currently running. So I approved it. It went through the conditions, the user automation. We hit our create job step. If I jump back over to Azure Automation here, here's that job that's all queued up. And I can go look at it, and here's all those input variables that I passed in from Azure Automation, so that gets failed. Can we find out where exactly it got failed? Yeah, I should find one. So it will actually give you the errors. Oh, here you go. This one failed. I had something wrong in there. If I go look at this, I have something going on with my client app ID and secret. So you can see it's the connect PNP. It's the same PowerShell error that you would be used to seeing within just a normal PowerShell console. So it was line 62, character 58. It gives me the commandlet, gives me all the error details. I don't know what's going on with that, but it means that the rest of the job probably won't work. All logs. Again, I don't know why that other output didn't work, but you can go view those outputs. So this was a write host. There was a connection error here. The unapproved, that's a normal warning that you get when you connect to Microsoft 365. So, or not to Exchange Online. So all of that does get logged here. Here's that normal console output as it goes through that creation process. So I don't know. This is still running. It may end up failing because it couldn't connect. But that process you can go through. Again, you can see the errors, you can see the output, you can always go back and monitor it. If you did want to get that job output and say email it off to somebody, back in when we were editing this job, you could go back into this create a job, and instead of that create a job, you could do the Azure Automation and get the job output. And same thing like we had before where we created it, is if we went and grabbed the subscription, the resource group, that automation account, job ID is going to get returned from the create job. So we can grab the job ID here and actually get that full output of the job. That console output, send it to an email. It comes back in a method you could go through and try to parse through it as well if you wanted to pull anything specific out of the job output. But that job output then would be available to you in order to take some additional actions on. So I think mine got stuck. I think it's going to get stuck because of that error. I do have a flaw in there every once in a while where if you get an error like that, because it waits for that job output, or that waits for that group to create, I do have to wait for it to fail in order for it to move on. Otherwise, it just sits and spins in this loop, indefinitely waiting for the group to create, which is why Microsoft puts that fair use stuff in there. So I have about 5 minutes left. There's a whole bunch more stuff I could show you. This is some of those Power BI reports I created from, same thing, running scripts. I actually write a bunch of data to a SQL database, tie it to Power BI, so I can view things like growth of different SharePoint sites within my environment, growth of mailboxes. But I will pop this back up. If anybody has any follow-up questions, does want to chat more, play from current slide. There's my email address. Feel free to email me. Hit me up on Twitter if you want to chat to me on Twitter. We do have 5 minutes left. If anybody has any questions that they have not put in chat yet, or wants to ask anything that they've been waiting for. But if not, thank you for joining me. I hope you enjoy the rest of your day, the rest of the conference. Thank you for having me. It's kind of fun being able to do all these conferences virtually from different places in the world. Or if you want to reach out later with questions once you've started working on this, feel free to email me, ask me any questions that you may want. And with that, I am done. That is your whirlwind overview of Azure Automation, Microsoft 365, and Power Automate.
And what a whirlwind overview that was, Ben. Thank you so much. I think that was highly, highly valuable to see that use case that you've shown there of everything working together, all those moving parts. Ben, there's lots of great feedback. Could you just share those contact details in the chat window?
Yes.
So people can easily connect with you, if that's okay?
To run Snap and Exchange with a webhook to add users inside a shared mailbox. So, Nicholas, I would do that. I haven't tried that yet. What I would probably do in your case is, again, I default back to being an IT pro. I don't like webhooks, but I would just do that with PowerShell, with Exchange Online PowerShell, and I don't know how you would want to trigger it. You could trigger it with a webhook. I have not gone into webhook triggering those runbooks a lot, but if you have all the details, the PowerShell is there. You can definitely go ahead and add users to shared mailboxes or grant them permission to shared mailboxes if you want to within there. Is there a way to sync? So hopefully that answers your question, Nicholas. Sorry, I'm not super familiar with the webhook, so that's an area I'm a little fuzzy on. Dynamics. Dynamics CRM tenant when license is assigned from Office 365. Sometimes the user doesn't appear to come back. So you guys are asking like about the topics that I don't do a lot with Dynamics. If there's a way to add them to the Dynamics CRM tenant or to sync them in PowerShell and there's a module out there, absolutely, you could force those users to come back to Dynamics 365 when that license is assigned. I don't know in detail how that sync to Dynamics 365 works. In terms of assigning licenses, I've even built Power Apps so like HR can manage licenses so that it goes and does all the license assignment in the background using PowerShell and Power Apps and Azure Automation so that people don't need to, you don't need to give the HR department user admin access to your tenant, but they can go create all those new users for you and put in all the details and the licenses get automatically assigned. It's kind of nifty. I have a whole user management app. I gotta keep it on time because someone else is supposed to go here too.
Yeah, thanks for that, Ben. And look, Anupam, I know what you're referring to there. Basically, I think what Anupam's referring to is where user licenses are being provisioned in in the AD group, but the AD group that's linked to the Power Platform tenant or environment or Dynamics environment doesn't get synced immediately. There's a bit of a delay. I remember that being a technical issue a few years ago. And I think what you want is a way of just running a command to force the sync, I think, Anupam. But feel free, I'm happy to connect with you on that later on. Just please post your email in the chat window. Happy to connect with you on that as well. But yeah, as Ben mentioned, there are PowerShell scripts to do that. So again, want to thank Ben, definitely under the circumstances, as well as being from across the Atlantic, joining us today on a very, very great session that I found very, very useful as well. So thank you, Ben. That was a really, really, really helpful. So I want to thank you once again.
Well, glad to do it, and thank you for having me. It was fun. Even though it's 5 a.m., it's not too bad. My coffee's kicking in, and I'm doing well.